Welcome to Mastering HTI-1 Decision Support Intervention. Bob Bryan, Senior Director of Drummond Advisory Services, and John Valukovich, Drummond's Director of Programs, will be walking you through the transition from traditional A9 clinical decision support to progressive B11 decision support intervention. Before I pass it over to the speakers, I'd like to mention that you can use the comment feature on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions throughout the webinar. And at the end of the presentation, Bob and John will take your questions. I'll also say that this is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording via email tomorrow. And with that said, Bob and John, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone once again to Mastering HTI-1 Decision Support Intervention. Pleasure to be here with my colleague, Bob Bryan, and we're going to have a discussion-based format and delve into the requirements and some of the nuances around this particular criteria for HTI-1. And Bob and his advisory services team is the perfect fit, really, to have a deep dive discussion about this. So again, John Valukovich, I've been with Drummond 5 years now. I'm a director of programs, and this relates to fire-based interoperability solutions is what I've been working on over the last year or so. So Bob, brief pass over to you for introductions, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, John. Glad to be here. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the director of Drummond Advisory Services. We help customers with the journey to certification, and we're spending a lot of our time these days with HTI-1 issues, and particularly the B11 DSI rule, which has a deadline at the end of this year.
It sure does, and we'll delve into that as part of the specific requirements and all. And if we look at this and we say, okay, HTI-1, a fair amount of criteria in it in this line item for now called Decision Support Interventions, DSI. And it's a revised version of CDS, Clinical Decision Support, and that criteria. And it includes the changes this year built into the final rule is really around transparency requirements. And if you think about it and you know your meaningful use and certification history, you'll know that this is really the first major revision to the certification program requirements for clinical decision support, going all the way back to 2012. So Bob, maybe we could, if you could sort of set the stage for those in attendance and give a brief overview about decision support, how it fits into the ONC certification program as a whole, just to start out.
Yeah, and first off, as you mentioned, John, the terminology has shifted from clinical decision support, or CDS, which was the name of the old rule, to decision support interventions, or DSI, which is the name of the new rule. But I always like to start the discussion with some context around the whole ONC program. And a key piece of it is the base EHR definition, which defines a range of capabilities that that ONC wants and CMS want to see across healthcare solutions. And we often think of interoperability around that, but really clinical decision support is actually one of the 4 elements of that program. And the others, physician order entry, healthcare quality, and then actual exchange of EHI. So those all go into the broad requirements for an EHR. And now we have this evolution in the clinical decision support space to decision support interventions, which extend to this predictive DSI concept. One other relationship with the whole program that I think is important is with the interoperability focus, there's an interoperability capability that plays into decision support, in the sense that with decision support, you're sharing the patient chart information with a decision support capability, and that might be developed by a base EHR certified health IT solution, or it might be developed by a third party. So this capability to share the core patient chart data, US CDI information, through capabilities like FHIR is a key part of the rule. They're not specifying FHIR as the way to do it, but many health IT developers are moving in that direction. And certainly FHIR is one path for that data sharing, which plays into, again, other requirements in the program for data sharing.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think if I was to put my EHR developer hat on, is I've made significant investments over the last couple of years to adopt a FHIR-based platform. As we look at options to additional US CDI elements, the increased amount of use cases, that if I have to think about my projected spend and my development roadmap to be able to convert and migrate and adopt FHIR as a platform makes a lot of sense. So it was good to see that at this point of the ruling to have an option to say that as I build external interoperability capabilities and even internal in some cases, I can leverage the FHIR platform to do that. So I thought that was interesting to see from a perspective of being in the interoperability arena a fair amount myself. So let's do this a little bit, Bob. You talked about this at the intro as well, as there's some changes moving from the traditional A9 criteria as we know it here in the test lab, right? Clinical decision support, to the B11 decision support intervention rule. And there's the new wording that replaces that. And you talked a little bit about that, but talk about too, what occurs this year. There are deadlines this year and how that sets up the following years as it relates to this new rule.
Yeah, so when the proposed rule came out, there were a whole bunch of major areas that had deadlines at the end of this year. When the final rule came out, many of those major areas, including the US CDI version 3 deadline, moved out to the end of 2025. But B11 decision support intervention is the one that stayed with a deadline at the end of this year. So that's important. It has to basically become available to the provider community January 1 of 2025. The big, there's a number of changes in the rule. The big one that a lot of people have been focused on is this predictive DSI component, which kind of brings in the artificial intelligence side of the world, which is pushing into healthcare. And the definition of predictive DSI as opposed to evidence-based DSI or clinical decision support under the A9 rule. Those are the two categories in the rule. And there are new things you need to do to support both. But because predictive decision support is a brand new category by itself, that's kind of the big one that's received a lot of focus. And this slide that we have up now actually kind of lays out the definition in a three-prong test, which is the way ONC has suggested that people think about it. So when you look at predictive DSI, I do encourage customers not to focus too much on that word predictive, because the third prong of this test talks about intervention results that include prediction, classification, recommendation, evaluation, or analysis. So it's a very broad set of things that can come out of an algorithm. And it's important to not be too focused on how they've named it and look at the definition. Secondly, I think the most important distinction between evidence-based, or often we think of that as rule-based decision support, is that in predictive, you're deriving those relationships not from rules, but from training data. Training data that plays into an algorithm or model. So that training data plays into a number of other requirements in the rule, particularly around risk management and source attributes that we can discuss more as we get into this.
That's a good point. Let's do this. And I think given we've done this definition now, Bob, probably the next thing is you prepared a slide that gives a couple of examples, which I think will probably help the audience out a little bit as well, start to make them some connections and really the difference between the traditional A9 and now the new B11. Maybe we could throw that slide up there really quickly and you can go through that.
Yeah, and I should say this slide is straight from the ONC. They built this diagram, and I think it's a great way to think about this world of AI in healthcare because there's a lot happening both in the pure clinical space and clinical applications. I think of as decision support activities that play into specific treatment areas. Like guiding surgical care is one that's shown here, as opposed to administrative applications that are essentially doing things that add efficiencies to practice. I mean, maybe they're doing clinical note summarization and some other operational processes. And the thing to be careful of for health IT developers is not to assume that those administrative applications don't fall under the rule. Because the reality is, if they're using patient data and they meet that definition of using a model or algorithm with training data to produce any of those types of results, then they do fall under the rule. You may not think of them as traditional clinical decision support, but they are decision support interventions that in some way affect patient care. Even if they're just creating efficiencies in terms of how clinicians do their work. So I think this slide helps to sort of illustrate the broad range of use cases that are out there that would come under this rule and that might be supplied directly by health IT developers, by EHRs, and also might be plugged into certified health IT by third-party developers.
Right.
And those are both scenarios that come under the rule.
Right. And we'll delve into that a little bit later too, because you raise a good point there about really the three options for it. So I just looked at this slide and I said to myself as a developer, this is a new category. So I see AI there as part of the criterion. More simply put, do developers have to have AI as part of this?
No, they don't. And that's a key thing that people have been confused about. They don't have to supply predictive capabilities, but they have to support them. And that kind of goes back to the discussion that we started with, where we were talking about FHIR as one method of sharing data with an external DSI that might be developed by another party, might be developed by a healthcare provider customer, might be developed by a third-party developer. Key thing is the patient data needs to get into the algorithm. That needs to come from the EHR. So that's part of supporting. And the ONC they've made clear that you don't have to supply these, but your platform needs to support them. So you need to be able to configure these DSIs on the platform. You need to enable your users to select them. And that's all part of this support area. And then you also need to be able to enable the management of source attributes related to these DSI capabilities. And we can discuss the source attributes in more detail as we go on here.
That's it. Yeah, good point. Good call. And I think while we're on this particular topic, Bob, you did a nice job of outlining support and supply. So if I'm in supply mode, then I have a risk management consideration, do I not?
Yes, that's right. If you supply either evidence-based or predictive DSIs, then there are some conditional requirements under the rule that are triggered. A big one for both is support for specific lists of source attributes. And source attributes, so the decision support capability is the source, and developers are being required to list attributes of that source. They're used to some of that in the traditional evidence-based clinical decision support space, because they've listed attributes like who's the developer, what's the funding source, that type of thing. There were 4 in the old rule. But there are new source attributes for both evidence-based and predictive DSIs now. And it kind of takes us back to this platform requirement space, which I think is important to think about. You know, we talked about the fact that you need to support both types of DSIs, be able to make that patient data available to those DSI components. In configuration, selection, and activation, there is also a feedback mechanism requirement that's important to note. This only applies to evidence-based DSIs, but you need to enable feedback from your customer base with some specific requirements around how that feedback gets packaged, as well as the ability to export that feedback data. And then some of these requirements apply to a limited set of users, which in my mind implies a level of access control about how you make these functions available as well.
Good points. Good points. Also, too, Bob, and while we're on this, and I think you did a nice job touching on, so there's traditional evidence-based decision support implemented under A9. So that there's new requirements for this particular area in that you touched on additional categories as it relates to source attributes, 4 to 13, for instance. Also, too, could you talk a little bit about the underpinnings for it and the touch point with USCDI v3, for instance?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, John. So this is an interesting part of the rule, because in the final rule for HTI-1 they pushed the USCDI version 3 deadline out 2 years, but the DSI rule specifically references USCDI data being available both to evidence-based and predictive DSIs. Whether you supply them or not. That creates an interesting development planning decision, because there are some specifics, data elements like demographics, for instance, sex and gender, that come in through USCDI version 3. Technically, you don't have to support those by the end of this year, but you will need to support them by the end of next year when USCDI version 1 goes away. So the question I would have as a developer is, what do I want to do with my DSI development plan? Do I want to just focus on the USCDI version 1 data and its impacts on my development plan? Or do I want to start pushing in USCDI version 3 earlier, which you're allowed to do? USCDI version 3 is a valid approach today. It was adopted in HTI-1. You're just not required to be fully compliant with it until the end of next year. But there's no limitation on your ability to bring it in to your current DSI project. And I think that's a consideration that developers need to think about.
Absolutely. I know I can speak to it from the interoperability side of things, especially with a Firebase platform. A lot of movement to USCDI v3 anyway as part of my Fire roadmap. And as again, we talked about earlier on, there's some hooks to perhaps the provisioning mechanism for DSIs is Fire anyway. So there's a lot of synergy between looking at USCDI versions and then adopting v3 perhaps earlier in an alignment with a Fire roadmap that may be possible part of aligned to your DSI roadmap. So that's a good point there. We talked a little bit about source attributes, what they are and how they apply and the numbers. And what I'd like to do, Bob, is delve into one of your core backgrounds prior to joining Drummond, risk management and all. So could you talk a little bit about the 3 elements as it relates to it may have impact with my DSI roadmap and the risk management that I take on as a supplier?
Yes. And this is a conditional requirement. If you supply predictive decision support capabilities to your customer base, then the risk management program requirements are triggered for those decision support capabilities that you supply. So it's a choice for developers. The risk management program, it has three elements: risk analysis, risk mitigation, and ongoing risk governance. So it's a program that's required. And there's even a condition of certification that requires you to summarize that program and make it available on a publicly available hyperlink. One of the important things to understand, though, about that program is it's closely tied in with the source attributes that are required, and many of the specific areas in the source attributes that you're required to publish within your health IT solution and expose them to your customers specifically relate to how you're running your risk management program. So for instance, and one thing about these source attributes, there are 31 for predictive DSIs plus another 9 of the attributes that are required for evidence-based support. So technically 40 attributes to be published. And within those attributes, there are things like how are you managing fairness and bias? And how are you managing validity over time? Not just the validity of the results you were getting when you developed the module, but how that validity continues to be measured over time. How you're monitoring this decision support capability with a learning model that may be evolving with new data. How you're looking at the predictive DSI as it moves from the initial patient population that you built it on to other patient populations that may have different demographics. All of this is coming into the source attributes. And then obviously that's part of a risk governance program. So it's important to understand that the relationship between the two, and understand that it's really a programmatic requirement, not a point in time requirement that you do at the time you develop a decision support capability. The last thing I'd mention on this is that the source attributes are transparency requirements from the perspective of the ONC. So they want you to disclose this information to your customers. They're not dictating what it says. They're only dictating that it be complete and up to date. So again, by using those words up to date, it implies ongoing governance. If you discover new risks, for instance, with your DSI, you need to disclose those new risks. They may not have been apparent when you developed the capability, but as they become apparent down the road, that's part of your ongoing governance of this decision support that you're providing to your customers.
Great. All right. So at this point, you've done a nice job of what are the changes between traditional CDS A9, new DSI? What does it mean with the tie-in to artificial intelligence? Getting into evidence-based decision support implemented, what's sort of new with that, and then the significant jump in attributes that have to be reported. And then, again, really delving into your particular background, Bob, as it relates to health IT with risk management. So I have an understanding of that, and I might call in the NIST framework to do this, ISO 42001. So I know all that. Now I'm sitting here, and there's some in the audience that'll say, okay, so for DSI that isn't supplied by the EHR themselves, are they covered by B11? Could you break that down just a little bit? I know you have some suggestions there about how to figure out what the demarcation line might be.
Yes. So this is an interesting question because, and I know I've heard from EHRs who are basically saying, so we may be supplying predictive DSI capabilities and we'll comply with the rule, but what about these other predictive DSI capabilities that my customers might plug in that might be developed by a startup? or might be developed by a healthcare provider organization themselves. Technically, they're not required to certify to B11, but B11 sets a trust standard in terms of providing transparency on the risk management activities around these DSIs, regardless of who's developed them. And that trust standard, I think, will set a standard across the industry. It's a good standard that the ONC has put out. And I see opportunities for third-party developers, for instance, to certify to the standards that the ONC has set here. In addition, because these source attributes will be exposed in the EHRs, that essentially it looks like most EHRs would have an interface for source attributes from any DSI that may get plugged into their solution. If you're plugging in a decision support capability that doesn't have source attribute information, then there's going to be a gap in terms of how end users evaluate that DSI versus a DSI that gives full visibility to how they're managing risk and what risks they've identified, who developed it, who funded it, all of those types of things that come in through the source attributes. So I would hope that we see a trend over time that these other categories of developers will come up to this standard, either directly through certification or through some other validated compliance with these standards, so that we have a consistent level of trust for the predictive decision support capabilities that are coming into healthcare.
It's a great way of saying it. And again, Bob, given your team's customer base and the way in which you go about researching and understand rules and regulations, obviously tapping into some knowledge base from the ACB, you also spend a fair amount of time over the last couple of weeks, I would call it in the field almost, is you were at Vive, you were at HIMSS, specifically attending sessions, talking to vendors, as a matter of fact, speaking with ONC and CMS. For those folks that weren't able to get out and sort of do that type of activity, what did you learn? What are vendors thinking about in terms of their strategy for DSI? I know you spent a fair amount of time out there.
Well, one of my observations was that in a number of sessions where I was able to listen to how major provider organizations are approaching the predictive decision support space and how they're looking at it, there's a definite concern about risk management and governance for them as consumers of this technology, as the number of AI predictive-based functions come into their organizations. So they're concerned with how they can evaluate all of the AI capabilities that will come into their healthcare workflows. And then it was interesting because as I talked to both EHR vendors and to third-party vendors that are in the predictive DSI space, there's a definite gap that I've seen, at least from the people I was able to talk to, in terms of their focus on risk management and governance. The EHRs know that they have a compliance standard that they need to meet. What I'm hearing in the third-party development space is not much knowledge or focus on that, because this rule doesn't directly come into their world. But one example is this. If a third-party developer is collaborating with a major EHR platform and wants to have a partnership relationship where their decision support capability is supplied by the EHR, then all of these requirements come into their space. At least the source attribute and risk management requirements, the conditional requirements is what I mean. So this crossover is going to get closer. And I do think that there's a level of knowledge that doesn't exist in the third-party solution community right now that should and probably will grow over time as the standard gets implemented by the EHR community.
Great. Well, we do have a few minutes for some questions. So what I'm going to do, team, is have started looking at the comment section. We had a number of questions, so we appreciate the attendance and the feedback and the questions that are asked up to this particular point. A few of them we actually already touched on in the conversation, which has been great. An example of the relation to USCDI v3, for instance. There was a question in there that we could take a stab at, and we may need some more time to take a look at this. But you did mention briefly, Bob, there was a question asked about real-world testing and how it relates to DSI, specifically evidence-based. So I know we talked about condition of certification. It's a requirement, and real-world testing is a part of that. Any dotted lines to DSI that you're aware of this early part of the game as it relates to real-world testing?
Yes. So the clinical decision support under both A9 and moving to B11 has been brought into the real-world testing program now. So that will cover both evidence-based and predictive decision support capabilities. So basically, you will start to do real-world testing if you're certified to A9 or B11 going forward.
Okay, fair enough on that. I know we have more guidance from the Drummond Test Lab coming on that. Here's an interesting one. A viewer asked about if a vendor is not certified, our impression, do we believe this will help differentiate from those that are, especially as artificial intelligence rises in use and popularity? And I know that dovetails with a whole other program we're looking at here from the Drummond side, but would you be able to entertain that one, Bob, in terms of the certification level and a differentiation point? I know I can speak to that from the FHIR client side, that it's real. But from the DSI and AI side, there's a lot of unknowns. And I like you at HIMSS, at Vive, some of the folks that I recognize on this webinar were there. It was AI everywhere, which is great. But there's a lot of unknown, and good actors versus bad actors still to be determined. So I think certification is probably an important role. Yes?
Yes, I do think it will become an important differentiation. And the reason is because from the provider perspective, how do they evaluate these decision support capabilities? How do they make not just buying decisions, but usage decisions as they move into their organizations? And what providers, consumers of health IT will start to see is that there is very transparent information about the usage, risks, and management of certified decision support capabilities. And if they're not seeing that from non-certified, first of all, they won't have this third-party standard that they can trust, and they won't have the actual data, the information about all of these source attributes. So I believe that the third-party development community will need to come up to the standard that the core certified health IT community will already be at, because it's going to be a trust issue for the consumers of this technology. It affects their ability to evaluate whether they really want to incorporate these capabilities into their patient workflows.
Great. And this was a repeat question, but I think it's worth entertaining again. You did address it earlier on in the presentation, Bob, but there's a question here about, I'm a health IT developer. The technicalities around whether I'm required to support predictive DSIs or not, in that they don't supply them as part of the EHR package, but they provide functionality for providers, clinicians, educators to define their own interventions. So with that in mind, again, how does the rule for B11 apply to an EHR vendor in that particular case? I think it's worth addressing that again.
Yeah, it is, because we've talked about this supplied issue, but we didn't really put a fine point on it. And the ONC actually has some good examples in the preamble to the final rule that they released. No one's required to provide predictive DSIs, first of all. And supplied, the line that they've really drawn, one thing they've said is that apps that simply sit in an app orchard that doesn't constitute a health IT vendor supplying them. But if you kind of roll up all the other examples they have, if there's any kind of a co-marketing or delivery relationship where the health IT developer is engaged in delivering and supporting the technology, helping to sell it, helping to implement it, a specific relationship with a third-party vendor, then it likely falls under that supply definition. So I kind of, it's not completely clear, but developers can read through the specific multiple examples that the ONC has given, and I think get a feel for where that line is just on one side of the app orchard, in essence.
Right. And I'll tackle two questions at once here, Bob, that relates back to the source attributes you discussed. You know, the evidence-based, 9 new ones, predictive, 31 source attributes that do have to be accounted for. So let's take on the role that the source attributes would be coming from a third party, which in today's world that's actually current. It might actually be coming from a Firebase source. Okay, so
right.
There is source attributes there that the Firebase source has to provide, and also if I'm sharing my predictive DSI with a system that might be outside certified technology, does that organization still need to support that EHR still support configuration and source attributes? My read on that would be yes, as the end delivery system. But your perspective?
And actually, that's an interesting nuance to the rule. The ONC in the recent companion guide that they published, and it was in the preamble as well to the final rule, they said that EHRs are not responsible for receiving the data. But they also say in one section of the rule that you have to have the ability to enter and access and modify source attribute data from a third party. They just don't say how that has to happen. So I think when they say you're not responsible for receiving it, what they're meaning is you just have to provide the capability for it to come into the EHR somehow. You don't have to assure that it happens, but so take this example. A healthcare provider develops their own in-house decision support capability for a particular clinical application. They may want to populate source attribute information into the EHR to enable their clinicians to understand how this support capability was developed, how it should be used, how it's being managed. So that might be manual entry. That might actually be a FHIR API. The rule doesn't specify how you have to do that. There just has to be some ability to get the data into the system, even if it's manual. And there has to be an ability to see it and modify it over time. But the ONC under the rule is really, they're not putting more responsibility on the developers, the certified developers, other than to simply have the capability to enter it and access it and modify the information. Beyond that, it's really it's really up to the developer to decide how they want to support those capabilities.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And given the time, Bob, I'm going to do two more quick ones, and then we do want to sort of wrap it up with the fact that this is complicated, and you need a consistent approach. And from the perspective of Drummond beyond what you have to do for just certification and satisfy the test lab requirements, Bob's team is here to have these discussions and delve into product road mapping and planning around this. But let me hit two more for you. Here's an interesting one. With all the new requirements for predictive DSI and the source attributes of the evidence-based side, do we see where the criterion may change to over time, perhaps live testing versus attestation, especially as we move more towards an integrated interfaced environment with the roadmap that includes FHIR? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know, but certainly that could happen down the road. We've seen it with other rules where the rules have started out with sort of higher level functional requirements like we have in this rule, and then they've become more prescriptive over time. For instance, the G10 rule is much more prescriptive in terms of the specific capabilities it requires. This rule is not quite at that level yet. It's really at the functional requirements level. Whether it moves to live testing as it becomes more prescriptive, I think that certainly is a possibility. And I'm sure the ONC will be assessing how the attestation approach is working with this rule in the current compliance cycle.
Yeah, very much. I know from my perspective, very much to a couple of years ago with the beginning of real world testing and how we've seen that grow over the course of the years and what the expectations are going forward. So I think you're right. One last one, Bob, this is in the weeds, but we'll give it a go, is do we have any information about the maintenance history of changes to any of those source attributes? Are there any timeframes around, or is there anything in the current rule that reads to that?
I don't know of anything specific that would require you to maintain history of the changes, essentially a change log. Not a bad idea, though.
Right.
Certainly.
That would be my answer. Yeah.
And I could see how that change history would be important to an overall governance program. In particular, it's kind of like an audit history. So in the sense that you want to show that your risk governance program has evolved, I would think that maintenance of that history would be useful. I'd have to delve into the specifics of the source attribute requirements again to see if there's anything that might imply the maintenance of that history, but I can't think of anything offhand.
Right. And that's where, again, we'll put a plug in there for advisory services, and what your team does is you have your background, a couple other team members with that risk management background. Those are the types of things that you might want to build into a strategy. So we certainly encourage follow-up, with our team on this particular criteria and others as it relates, obviously, to HTI-1. But we hope over the course of almost 45 minutes here, those that were able to attend, we do thank you for attending and asking some questions. We have collected all of the questions, and we have a couple that we're going to have direct follow-up with, but we certainly encourage you, as you can see here. So, Lynn, I'll pass the microphone off to you for a final wrap-up, if I could, please. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, John, and thank you, Bob. And thank you for everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. If you have questions about what was covered today or HTI planning and requirements, compliance budget planning, and more, you can book a free consultation with Bob using the QR code that you see on your screen. As well, you might see some familiar faces next week for our next webinar. We have Heather Kelty and James Threet doing another HTI webinar. So you can also register using the other QR code you see on the screen. So I think that about wraps it up. Thank you for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you.